For 75 years, NATO has trained itself to answer one question: who would attack us from the outside? No one prepared it for this one. What if the most serious threat to the alliance does not come from Moscow or Beijing, but from Washington itself? In a gilded room in Paris, European leaders gathered to save a peace plan for Ukraine. They spoke carefully. They chose every word, because hovering over that meeting was a single destabilizing fact. The President of the United States had just declared that America needs Greenland and refused to rule out force. This was not a joke, not a provocation, not nostalgia for empire. It was a warning. When the world's most powerful NATO member openly questions the sovereignty of another NATO country, the rules change. Silence becomes strategy. Fear becomes policy. And alliances reveal their true strength or their weakness. If you care about how power really works in today's world, stay with me. Because to understand why Greenland suddenly matters so much, we first need to understand how Europe allowed itself to become this exposed. At first glance, the argument over Greenland looks like a diplomatic sideshow, a strange distraction unfolding while Europe is consumed by a much bigger war in Ukraine. But that is precisely the mistake, because Greenland is not really about territory. It is about power, about dependency, and about what happens when the assumptions that have governed Europe's security for decades suddenly stop holding. In Paris, European leaders were trying to do two things at once. They were urging Washington to stay committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, while quietly hoping the same Washington would stop questioning the sovereignty of one of its own NATO allies, Denmark. Those two conversations collided. The result was paralysis. Europe wanted unity, but spoke in fragments. It wanted firmness, but chose caution. And behind every sentence was the same calculation: do not anger the United States, because Europe still cannot defend itself without it. This is the core dilemma. Greenland exposes a truth Europe prefers not to confront. To understand how we reach this point, we need to rewind past Trump, past Ukraine, and look at the deeper history of Europe's strategic dependence. To understand this dependence, we have to go back to the moment it was deliberately built. After the Second World War, Europe made a rational choice. Exhausted, divided, and fearful of the Soviet Union, it outsourced its security to the United States. NATO was not just a military alliance. It was an insurance policy. America provided the power. Europe rebuilt its prosperity. Over time, this bargain hardened into habit. European nations reduced defense spending. They integrated economically, not militarily. Security became something managed in Washington, not produced in Europe. And as the Cold War faded, so did the sense of urgency. The peace dividend felt permanent. But history never stops moving. As global power shifted, the Arctic quietly returned to the map. Melting ice opened new routes. Russia reasserted itself. China arrived with ships and investment. Greenland, once peripheral, became strategic again. And yet, Europe's posture barely changed. The mechanism was simple. Dependency breeds complacency. Complacency erodes leverage. So when an American president speaks bluntly about Greenland today, he is not breaking a system. He is exploiting one that Europe allowed to form. And that brings us to the first real shock, when this quiet imbalance suddenly turned into open crisis. The crisis did not begin with a missile or a military exercise. It began with words: "We need Greenland," from the President of the United States. Not whispered, not back-channeled, said publicly, and followed by something far more destabilizing: a refusal to rule out force. At that moment, a line was crossed. European leaders watched Washington intervene militarily in Venezuela, detaining its president. Almost immediately after, the same administration questioned Denmark's ability to secure its own territory. Two actions, one message: sovereignty is conditional. In Copenhagen, the mood hardened. Denmark pledged billions for Arctic defense. Its prime minister warned that the threat should be taken seriously. But in Europe's capitals, the reaction was slower and fractured. A statement emerged, carefully worded: limited in signatories, affirming that Greenland is part of NATO and that only Denmark and Greenland can decide its future. It was diplomacy by compromise, and it revealed something uncomfortable. When faced with an unprecedented challenge from inside the alliance, Europe hesitated not because it lacked words, but because it feared consequences. This was no longer theoretical. The system was under strain, and beneath the surface, deeper mechanisms were already at work. What makes this moment so dangerous is not the rhetoric itself, but the machinery behind it. NATO was designed to deter threats from the outside. Its logic is clear, its treaties are precise, but they are silent on one scenario: what happens when pressure comes from the strongest ally within? There is no mechanism for that. Article 5 assumes unity of purpose. It assumes shared definitions of threat. It assumes that power is restrained by mutual trust. When that trust erodes, the alliance does not break dramatically, it freezes. This is the hidden mechanism now exposed. Europe depends on the United States, not just for troops or weapons, but for intelligence, command structures, and strategic coordination. Washington knows this, and dependency changes the balance of negotiation. So when European leaders choose caution over confrontation, it is not cowardice, it is calculation. They are weighing every sentence against the risk of losing American support on Ukraine, on deterrence, on defense itself. The paradox is brutal. The more Europe fears abandonment, the less leverage it has. And the less leverage it has, the more unilateral power shifts to Washington. That imbalance does not stay quiet for long. It produces the second sharper crisis, one that brings the consequences directly to Europe's doorstep. The second crisis is quieter but far more destabilizing. It unfolds not in speeches, but in silence. As tensions over Greenland escalated, Europe's biggest powers hesitated. London, Paris, Berlin all spoke eventually, but carefully. No direct challenge, no red lines, just reassurance, wrapped in restraint. And Washington noticed, because in power politics, hesitation is information. The message received in the White House was not confusion, it was clarity. Europe would not fight, Europe would not retaliate, Europe would adapt. That understanding alone shifts the balance without a single soldier moving. Inside NATO meetings, the unthinkable began to surface. What if the United States acted unilaterally? What would Europe actually do? The answer, increasingly, was very little. Not because Europe lacks values, but because it lacks options. This is the escalation point. When credibility erodes, deterrence follows. When deterrence weakens, pressure increases. And suddenly, a question that once sounded absurd becomes unavoidable. What happens when a security alliance cannot protect one of its own from its most powerful member? That question now hangs over Europe. And it is no longer abstract. It reaches into the daily lives of ordinary people, quietly, relentlessly, and closer than many realize. And this is where the story stops being abstract and starts to touch you. Because when alliances weaken, it is not diplomats who pay first, it is citizens. If you live in Europe, this tension shapes your future in ways that are easy to miss. Higher defense spending means fewer resources elsewhere. Strategic uncertainty means markets hesitate. Jobs feel less secure. Energy feels less predictable. And trust in institutions meant to protect you slowly erodes. You are told this is about Greenland, or Ukraine, or NATO procedures. But underneath, it is about whether the system that kept Europe stable for generations can still be relied upon. When leaders hesitate, you feel it as anxiety. When they stay silent, you feel it as doubt. And when power becomes unpredictable, everyday life becomes more fragile. This is why these moments matter. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are cumulative. If you've ever wondered why global politics suddenly feels closer, heavier, more personal than before, this is why. Stay with me, because the consequences do not stop at Europe's borders. They ripple outward, reshaping the world you live in. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, because the moment uncertainty enters NATO, it sends a signal far beyond Europe. Moscow watches carefully, Beijing watches patiently, others take notes. If the United States can openly pressure a NATO ally over territory, then the meaning of alliance commitments everywhere begins to blur. Red lines look softer, guarantees look negotiable, and power, once again, appears to trump rules. In Russia, this reinforces a long-held belief: Western unity is conditional, that it fractures under stress. In China, the lesson is different but just as dangerous, that strategic patience combined with economic and military pressure can exploit divisions without firing a shot. This is how local crises become global accelerants. Allies in Asia ask whether security guarantees are permanent or personal, tied not to institutions but to whoever occupies the Oval Office. Smaller states everywhere begin recalculating their risks. Some hedge, some rearm, some look for new patrons. The world becomes less predictable, more transactional, more brittle. And in that world, Europe's hesitation over Greenland is not a footnote, it is a case study. Which brings us to the hardest question of all: what happens next? Because from here, the future does not unfold in a single direction, but along several possible paths. From this point, the future splits into three paths, and none of them are cost-free. The first is the optimistic scenario. Europe finally absorbs the shock. It accelerates defense integration. It reduces critical dependencies. It speaks with one voice, not 27. In this future, Greenland becomes a turning point, the moment Europe chose strategic adulthood. NATO survives, but as a more balanced alliance. Stronger, clearer, more resilient. The second path is muddled continuity. Nothing breaks, but nothing truly changes. Europe issues statements, it spends more slowly. When it avoids confrontation, hoping personalities will shift in Washington. Greenland remains unresolved, managed through ambiguity. The system holds, but only barely. Stability becomes temporary, conditional, and fragile. Then there is the darkest scenario. Europe stays divided. Dependency deepens. Unilateral actions become normalized. NATO's credibility erodes, not through collapse, but through quiet irrelevance. Smaller states stop believing guarantees. Power politics fills the vacuum, and the rules-based order Europe relied on becomes optional. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems rarely fail overnight. They decay through avoidance. Which path emerges will not be decided by speeches alone, but by choices made under pressure. And that leaves us with one final question, one that brings this story full circle. What does Europe do when the moment to choose can no longer be postponed? For most of its history, Europe believed its greatest achievement was ending war on its own continent. But peace, it turns out, was never self-sustaining. It was protected, underwritten, and quietly guaranteed by power Europe no longer fully controls. Greenland forces a reckoning, not because the island itself will be taken tomorrow, but because the illusion it exposes can no longer be maintained. Alliances are not moral contracts, they are instruments of interest. And when interests shift, sentiment offers no protection. The real question is not what Washington will do next. It is whether Europe is willing to grow into the responsibility it has long postponed. Strategic autonomy is not about opposing the United States. It is about no longer fearing it. It is about having options when pressure arrives from anywhere, including from friends. If Europe chooses unity, investment, and clarity, this crisis will be remembered as a warning that worked. If it does not, Greenland will not be the last test, just the first. If this analysis helped you see today's headlines differently, stay with this conversation, share it, question it, and keep watching, because the next chapter of global power is already being written, and Europe is running out of time to decide its role.